with Bob and with Mark, who as you heard, I served with both of them on the SUNY board. But Bob is an example of the kind of leader that we really need, both in business and government and across society, to get us past the finger pointing about who created a problem and really move towards the solutions. So you heard a little bit about my background. It was started off in the public sector. I started off working for the mayor in the city of New York, ran a program there called the Urban Corps. Interestingly enough, that too was modeled after the Peace Corps. At that point, the mayor of the city of New York was looking for a way to engage young people in city government. And at that point, there was a federal college work study program, which was initiated in the Johnson administration, and it provided money for universities for students to work to earn the tuition to pay for their college. And in those days, most of the work was done on campus, and the federal funding paid for 80% of their salaries. And he called those university presidents together and said, I want you to give your students the opportunity to work off campus. And we, the city of New York, will pay the 20 cents on the dollar. And by the early 1970s, that resulted in about 10,000 young people working in city government every year, leveraging the federal college work study, but instead of only giving them money for their tuition, it gave them real work experience that helped their career. So that was an opportunity for me to learn a little bit about how city government operates, what advantage there might be of getting young people engaged and involved in every enterprise within the city. And then shortly after that, I formed a think tank in New York during the fiscal crisis to come up with counter-budget options so that all of the reductions that the city was forced to make wouldn't be in the areas that would hurt people the most. So if a school system had a budget number, why cut teachers? Why not look at what opportunities you would have on the administrative side? And then from that, again, I became deputy chancellor of schools, large urban school system with over 1 million students. And there were huge challenges, especially during the early 90s with a recession and big budget cuts and figuring out how you could actually maintain services without cutting things that would hurt young people. So, and then Lou Gerstner, who was the CEO of IBM, recruited me to IBM. I thought I would stay maybe a year or two, and wound up completing close to a 25-year career at a company, IBM. And so my experience in the public sector, in civil society, working with not-for-profits, and then in business, taught me that there's a lot of good in all sectors. And there's areas where people don't do so well, and they obviously need to do better. But the reason I wrote this book is we're living in a time right now where there's a good deal of finger-pointing from both sides of the aisle about the role of the private sector. And I thought it was important to get past the rhetoric and talk a little bit about the facts. What are the facts about the role that the private sector plays in society? And I divided this book into 3 sections. So section number 1 is, what is the history? What is the role that the private sector has played in society? And let's look back over America's history. And actually, when you think about some of the most progressive things that people are talking about today, most of them started not in government, they started in the private sector. How many people do you think know that the idea of providing free health care for your employees started with a company in New York, Macy's, in 1870, offered free health care for all of their employees. And very shortly thereafter, hundreds and hundreds of other companies followed Macy's model. In 1870, if you worked for New York state government or the federal government, you didn't get health coverage. You got it in the private sector because it was done because the company believed that it would build productivity and loyalty from their employees. How many people do you think know that in 1875, American Express set up the first pension plan? Do you know that in 1875, the only people who got a pension were Civil War veterans? No other entity, no government entity provided pension. And shortly thereafter, companies like GE and others adopted pension plans for their employees. We've had a lot of discussion now about the importance of vacation, a paid vacation. That started in the private sector. In 1904, a study was done of large companies, and close to 50% of them provided 1 week of paid vacation. If you worked for the federal government, they were closed on Christmas, but their employees didn't get paid for Christmas. So there was no paid vacation in the public sector. It started in the private sector. Those are examples of what we characterize as a progressive behavior, but they didn't start with government. They weren't legislated. They weren't regulated. They were started by the private sector, and they became the model for labor practices across the United States. I don't think people understand much about that from a historical standpoint. And it didn't end in the 1904, 1905 time frame. There were companies that instituted the 40-hour work week before it was regulated. IBM was one of them, but many others. There were companies that instituted overtime pay before the federal government did. It started in the private sector. It didn't start within government. Bob mentioned Kodak, George Eastman. Do you know that in 1920, roughly 100 years ago, George Eastman took 1/3 of all of his personal stock holdings and he gave it to his employees? Do you know what that story would be today? CEO gives $250 million to his employees. Gave it to build loyalty among his employees. Now, he did a lot of other things that were important in terms of community activities, but again, it was something that was done by a government, not a government regulation, not by a government legislation, but it was done by a leader in the private sector, and those behaviors became models for others. We're at a time period now where people are talking about the idea of public-private partnership. And we think, is that a new idea? Well, actually, one of the things I had an opportunity to do when I wrote this book was to look through the IBM archives. And I found some really interesting stories about public-private partnership. Do you know that in the 1930s, a piece of legislation passed, it's called Social Security? And Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor, the first woman cabinet member. And when the legislation passed, she went out to talk to consultants in the business community about implementing this legislation. There were 26 million people that would be eligible. They came from almost 3 million employers, and in the 1930s, the technology to actually implement and manage a program like that didn't exist. And everybody that she talked to said it's going to take 2 to 3 years to implement Social Security. And she went to meet with a guy that she knew from New York State named Tom Watson, who ran a company called IBM. And he asked his staff after the meeting, is it possible that we could bid on this contract and implement Social Security? And they said, well, the information that she's been given about 2 to 3 years is probably right, but we've been working on this new machine. We call it a collator. And actually, if you would give us the money to develop the machine, we think we could actually implement this program sooner. But it's a government contract on an RFP. You wouldn't get any of your money back built into this agreement. So you would just have to do it. And he said, do it. Go ahead and do it. And Social Security was implemented in 10 months, not 3 years. And 4 years later, he doubled the size of his company. So was it good for the company? Yes. Was it good for society? Yes. Was that a public-private partnership? A good example. About a decade later, he had the first IBM research laboratory at Columbia University, where I'm now teaching. And he had a lunch appointment with the dean and president of Columbia, talking about what kinds of things they could do together, and suggested that maybe Columbia could offer coursework that would help prepare people for growing jobs in the computer area and in the computer industry. And it was a very productive lunch. It lasted 2.5 hours. And they agreed that Columbia would actually begin this program. And in the letter, handwritten letter in the archives, he suggests, why don't we call it computer science? The academic discipline of computer science began in a public-private partnership after a lunch at the University Club in New York City in 1946. And obviously that's something that has been developed by colleges and universities around the United States and around the world. And arguably it was critically important in terms of building economic growth, in the country in the second half of the 20th century. It was a public-private partnership. It was something that was done, and it couldn't have been done if people in education and people in business saw each other as enemies of one another. In terms of government and business working together, there are ample examples where that has been done. When Kennedy was elected president, they were looking to get companies to do more in terms of the diversity of their hires. And he, again, convened a meeting of about 260 companies at the White House and asked people to make voluntary commitments to increase the number of African American employees in their companies. In 3 years, they went from 30,000 to 43,000 employees. The average gain was about 8.5% to 9%. IBM's gain was 24%. But it was something that was done at a time before they could get a Civil Rights Act passed. It was something that was done on a voluntary basis. So actually, when we look at the history, whether it's the 1870s, the 1950s, in 1953, IBM opened 2 manufacturing plants below the Mason-Dixon line, one in Kentucky, one in North Carolina, and they were both integrated at a time when there weren't integrated manufacturing plants below the Mason-Dixon line. It actually wound up integrating the schools in Lexington, Kentucky, and the manufacturing facility became Lexmark Computers. So the history of the United States demonstrates, was there bad behavior from companies? Absolutely. The robber barons, right? We read about the history. There's lots of examples of bad ethics by the private sector, but overwhelmingly, if we look at the history, it's not that corporations were the problem. It's not that business was the problem. Businesses, large and small, demonstrated a commitment to community, a commitment to their employees, and that is the history of the United States. Those are the facts. The rhetoric isn't borne out when you look at the actual fact. So that's the history. So where are we today? We're pretty much in the same place. We've got examples of bad behavior, just like the robber barons. Don't hold up Bernie Madoff as an example of ethical behavior, or Enron, or WorldCom. Even great companies make mistakes. Volkswagen. Lots of examples of companies that have had errors, bad ethics, bad behavior. Some should be punished. But just like we had examples of good behavior in the past, we have the same thing going on today. In New York State, they passed a piece of legislation, the Excelsior Scholarship, free tuition. There are many companies that have offered free tuition. Starbucks is one example. Disney is another, providing free tuition for their employees. There are companies that are providing same-sex benefits long before government did, providing opportunity for their employees to have access to early childhood education and other kinds of things. So that idea that the business behavior is bad because they're in the private sector is just not true. And by the way, when we look at bad behavior, we can find it in government. We can find it in the not-for-profit community. After Hurricane Sandy, there were not-for-profit agencies that raised money promising to do things, and they used the money for other areas. Is that right? No, it's not right. But does that mean that agencies, not-for-profit agencies that do disaster relief and recovery are all bad? No. It means that there was bad behavior and it ought to be punished when we identify it. So the history and the present demonstrates that there is examples of bad, but it also demonstrates that the private sector that we need to rely on for economic growth and economic opportunity should not be the focus of rhetoric that's all negative. Is the private sector the cause of income inequality, bad education, the shredding of the social safety net? The facts don't bear that out. Now, Bob talked about a couple of things that I was involved in at IBM, and I think that there are examples of good behavior by a company actually benefiting society, but also benefiting the company's bottom line. So Bob talked about the program that I created at IBM called the Corporate Service Corps. And what we did there at IBM is each year we selected 500 to 800 of the top talent within the company who had worked for the company for 5 to 7 years. And we gave them a team assignment in the developing world to solve a critical problem. So we sent a team, one example, into Cross River Province in Nigeria. The electeds had passed a piece of legislation that provided free health care, but they didn't know how to operate it and set it up. A team of 12 people at IBM working for 1 month actually set up the system, and in 3 years, 95,000 poor women and children received health care. It was a donation of time. How did it benefit the company? The people who were involved in this kind of a program had retention rates that were over 80% higher than top talent in the company that didn't have those kinds of experiences. So it helped the company retain top talent by giving them opportunities that they didn't think they would ever be able to have while they were doing a day job. It also became the third most important reason why top talent chose to work for the company, behind money and location. And it wound up building business in those growth markets, about $500 million worth of business, from governments that the company had no relationship with, but the relationships were built through this corporate service corps. And now dozens of other companies, from J.P. Morgan to Dow Chemical and others, are following that model. Is it good for society? Yes, absolutely. Is it good for the company's bottom line? Absolutely. There was a recent study that was done that looked at the companies that had the best corporate social responsibility and the companies that had the worst. And they determined that if you invested $1,000 over a 20-year period, the companies that had the best behavior, your $1,000 resulted in $25,000. And for those that had the worst, your $1,000 resulted in $15,000. It provided a bottom line for the investors. Socially responsible investment funds have more than $1 trillion worth of assets. So they're going to invest in companies that have strong social responsibility. The PTEC program that Bob talked about, which IBM set up in 2011, formed it in 2010, now exists across 12 states, involves over 450 companies. They're providing mentors for the students in a grade 9 through 14 program. They're providing paid internships. And the students who graduate, largely on the public dollar, wind up having the kind of skills that companies want to hire for their company. We've hired dozens of those students with average starting salaries of $55,000 a year, with an associate's degree in engineering or computer science, and they're working and providing the kind of skills that you want at a time when we have a skills crisis. So that's an example of where we are today. We have examples of good behavior, and it's not just a company like IBM, it's lots of companies. J.P. Morgan just announced a $500 million commitment to enter into partnerships with cities to improve the quality of cities. Detroit was one of their first grantees. They provided a significant amount of resources. They also wound up having $1 billion worth of additional revenue out of the city of Detroit. So, good for the company? Yeah. Good for the city of Detroit? Absolutely. American Express has set up a large-scale training program for not-for-profit organizations. It's not government that's doing it. Government has contracts with not-for-profits. They don't invest in their skills. But that's something that a company like American Express decided was good. So corporate social responsibility is something that is good for companies, it's good for society, and the idea that companies are the problem is just not true. It's not borne out by the facts. So that was 2/3 of what I put in this book, the history and where we are today. But the last section of the book is, where could we be in the future? Do we really want a situation where we have examples of good behavior, examples of bad behavior, and the relentless finger pointing at certain segment of society as being the cause of all ill? Or can we think about operating in a different way? And I focus in on a couple of issues that I think are important, and one that I think is very, very germane to where we are today in virtually every region in the United States, and that is the issue of regulation. How does government think about regulating business? They've always thought about it from the standpoint of regulating bad behavior. We need a regulation, we have to put it in place to be able to catch the worst incidents of behavior from the private sector. Now, does that mean that if people behave poorly in an environmental area that they shouldn't be punished? No. But what about incentives for the best behavior? What about if you wanted people to exhibit strong behavior in labor, why don't you think about incenting them to do that? It could be financial, it could be recognition, right? In New York City, Mayor Bloomberg was looking to increase the quality of restaurants, and he developed a letter grade system, so you got an A. You didn't get penalized if you were a B. You got an A that you could post in your window, and you got recognized. And did more restaurants want to be an A? Yes, absolutely. But it was voluntary. There was no penalty involved in being on the other side. So if you want the best business practices, if you want the best environmental practices, why not think about using government as an opportunity to incent the best, reward the best, recognize the best, and don't only think about regulation as the opportunity to penalize and slap people for the worst. That's an opportunity to rethink how we think about the relationship between business and government. And what about ethics? What about that? We have a Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act, a federal piece of legislation that's designed to regulate ethical behavior. What about providing more opportunity and incentives to have a high ethical standard? You know, there are graduate schools in business, in law, in medicine that might offer a course in ethics. What about building ethics into how we educate people? Wouldn't that be an interesting idea? Not suggesting that you eliminate a strong academic curriculum, but if you're going to teach people about math and science, are there examples in project learning, project-based learning, that could be about ethics to reinforce strong ethical behavior? And might that not give us a higher set of ethical standard as a society? I think that's critically important. That's something that would benefit business, it would benefit government, it would benefit civil society, but ethics is really behind what differentiates good and bad behavior. So if you think it's only because your paycheck comes from the private sector as opposed to the public sector, no, it's about the ethical standard that you have as an individual. And that's an opportunity to think about ethics, regulation, as things that, not that government should do on their own, but they should be part of a collaborative activity between business and government and civil society. Which gets to the issue about leadership. You know, we're at a period of time where we're looking for the kind of leadership that the country has had in our history, and we need it today. But we don't have a lot of opportunities where there's joint leadership developed across the sectors. We have things that happen in the business community, either through chambers and trade associations, then the government gets together to think and plan together, and the same is true in the not-for-profit sector. What about thinking about planning and leading together, where we would understand each sector of society's challenges and use that as an opportunity to inform our leadership and make sure that the voice of leadership, the people who are most influential, are on the same page and they're talking together. These are things that we could do differently, behaving differently, that might get us from examples of good, examples of bad, just like we had in the 1900s and just like we have today. So what might some of those examples look like? Let me give you a couple of examples that I talked about in the book. And they're not exclusive, they're just examples. In education today, we've got what could be characterized as a teaching crisis. Pick up the paper and we have a teacher strike in Los Angeles, and a teacher strike in Denver, and teacher strikes in the Midwest and in the West. We have a crisis, and that's about the way that we treat our teachers, the way that we pay them, but it's also about the quality of teaching. It's about the quality. One of the things that we know, and I know from my past experience as Deputy Chancellor of Schools in New York City, is a high-quality teacher is a really differentiator about high-quality academic performance and whether or not students are going to succeed. So we have an opportunity today. We have millions of people in the workforce right now who are nearing retirement, who have backgrounds in math, backgrounds in science, advanced engineering certificates and degrees, and there was a time when people wanted to retire and stop working, and now people want an encore career. What about thinking about an encore career in teaching? What about thinking about incentives that could get those people to look at a 5, 7, or 10-year second career as a teacher? At IBM, we set up a program I call Transition to Teaching, where we provided a $15,000 incentive if you were looking for early retirement and you were looking for a second career, and you used that money to be able to get your teaching credential, do practice teaching, and we moved 100 people in the company at an average retirement age of 55 into teaching jobs, and they all had advanced degrees, they all had experience in math and science, and their retention rate, not one person left at the end of 5 years. And you know what the high retention rates, low retention rates are for teachers who come into the teaching workforce right out of college. So that could be an opportunity. Now, will large numbers of companies have $15,000 to spend on all of their employees? Absolutely not. Is that something that government could think about doing in a collaborative way with business? Are we going to wind up with 1 million people coming through a program like that? No. Could we get 50,000, 20,000, 40,000? Could we bring people into the teaching workforce if we looked at the private sector as an effective collaborator and partner? I think it would be a terrific opportunity. It would actually be cheaper than the cost of bringing people into teaching in the more traditional ways. And that's another example of a way of thinking about solving a problem with business at the table as opposed to being on the other side of the table. We also have, in the area of education, lots of school systems around the United States that are losing population, and they're thinking about closing their schools. In Chicago, they closed a number of schools that were part occupied, and it became so negative that it has led to Mayor Rahm Emanuel not running for re-election. That was probably as important as any other issue, the fact that he did school closures. Well, when you have a school that's 40% occupied or 70% occupied, what about using that space as maker space for business? Would business benefit by having access to a space in a high school that has a gym and a cafeteria and is not only used only 5 days a week? And could you ask for people who occupied that space to mentor teachers, mentor students, do things that would benefit the school? Absolutely. We have lots of collaboration and partnerships in higher education. Silicon Valley was built around the notion of bringing businesses into higher education institutions. Could that be something that you could do effectively using space in elementary, middle, and high schools? Doesn't have to cost money, but it can't be done if you thought business was the enemy. It could only be done if you thought that there was opportunity and benefit and collaboration from working together. The last example I would cite is something that was done by a company, AT&T. They have 200,000 employees, and 100,000 of them work on hardware. And that job is going out of business. And those people are in danger of losing their job. So AT&T invested $200 million to reskill its workforce, providing education and training so that those people would get the software skills that they could practice in the company because the skills in the company are changing. Is that an example and an opportunity that we could think about doing more broadly? Not every company, large, medium, or small, has the resources that AT&T has to invest in its employees, but that is an opportunity for government, higher education, and business to work together on the challenge of reskilling the workforce. This is a real challenge, but it's not going to be solved with finger pointing. So what is this book about? It's about the history. It's not that business is bad. The present, it's not that business is the problem. The future, it's that business working collaboratively with government is the solution to our problems. It's not the problem. And we've got to change the rhetoric, and we've got to change the finger pointing, because it only results in things that wind up not benefiting economic opportunity and growth in the private sector, but it winds up hurting society. It winds up creating more problems than we need to have. So that's where I think we are today. That's where I think we could be in the future. And I think we could get there if we could stop the nonsense and stop the finger pointing and focus again on the thing that makes the country strong and effective, which is getting together and solving problems across sector and doing it in a way that benefits society the most. So thank you very much for your time, and I think I've got an opportunity to take any questions. Yes, sir.
So when John King was Commissioner of Education in New York, he publicly, in a large conference, called out the Rochester City School District as the nation's worst. Researchers at Stanford and Harvard say the same thing. We're one of the few districts in the country that spend too much per kid.
Right.
We have one employee for every 4 students, and it's bloated. In the 6 or so cities where they're really making an improvement in their urban districts, it's the business community that has been driving it. In Rochester, we sort of, our business community, sort of, the city school district is like the third rail. I mean, we avoid it, it's impolite. Any suggestions on how we could get our business community to say, come on, we gotta fix this. P-Tech in the district will kill it. It's like putting a flower in soil that's highly radioactive. We've got to get rid of the radioactive soil. Any ideas how we can get the business community to start pushing to demand change, fundamental change?
Yeah, I mean, I have one idea to start that discussion, is that we've had a history in the United States very often of convening leaders cross-sector to be able to get people on the same page off of a similar set of data. So with the leadership of the business community, perhaps the leadership at the state level from the governor, perhaps at the county level, perhaps bringing the state education department together with the Rochester City Schools convene the equivalent of a summit meeting that says, here's where Rochester is today, here's where other school districts are today, here's the opportunity for a path forward, and can we actually set some very, very specific measurable goals over a 1, 2, 3, 5-year period, and agree to a governance structure, not substituting for the school board, but a governance structure that's going to regularly report out to the public what kind of achievement we've been able to make and try to move towards a path that's different from the past. Now, is that perfect? No, because people at a local level could walk the other way and move away from, but I think it's step number one. Step number two, I think, would be to try to figure out a way to expand an idea like PTEC across Rochester in the way that it has been done in other geographies across the state and other states across the United States. Because that's an opportunity where you're really providing an opportunity to connect the skill of the young people as they move from school to college to career. So I think the summit idea, I think, would be step number one. Now, we did that in 1996 in the United States. IBM actually convened a summit meeting with President Clinton, 48 of the 50 governors, CEOs from every state, education leaders, and there were, at the beginning of that summit in 1996, there were 14 of the 50 states that had any kind of an education standard, and at the end of 1998, it went to 47 states. So it had an improvement. Was it a perfect scenario? No. But I think that might be step number one.
Our summit pretty much is filled with people who are part of the problem, and is excluding the people who actually had some experience.
Well, I would just say that, you know, they report to the state education department, they report to the state for their resources, and maybe that's an opportunity to get them to move to a different level, and if it's not, maybe they could be replaced. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought it was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed when you were talking about collaboration between public and private. One thing you didn't mention, though, was the influence of big money in politics, like Citizens United. And that's why if you can comment on that, because that seems to, you know, in the public mindset, pave the path towards deregulation of that, and maybe things like the incentives you talked about help offset it. Maybe you could elaborate.
Yeah, I think that the money in politics is a bad thing. I mean, I don't think it helps to influence legislators based upon how much money they get and who gave it to them. And I'll give you a personal example. When I was Deputy Chancellor of Schools, I was looking for ways to solve a budget crisis without making budget cuts. And I thought, we have almost 80,000 teachers in the New York City public schools, and when they get called for jury duty during the school year, we have to pay money for substitute teachers. And that was 1990, and that was a bill of about $15 million a year. Today it's more like about $95 million a year. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get teachers to be called for jury duty in the summer while they're not teaching? And it would save us the money, and we could use the money to not lay off teachers. And I came up to Albany and I was told, great, if you can get the New York State United Teachers on here, we'll pass the legislation. Because the New York State United Teachers was a major contributor to people on both sides of the aisle. So it didn't get passed. It was a good idea. It was the money. It was the influence and it was the money. So whether it comes from a union or it comes from business or it comes from any, is that what you really want as the barrier? You know, be able to, now I came up with another idea that I actually did put in place, which was I went to the teachers union and I said, we've got this problem and I need a lot of givebacks. And they said, give back? What are you giving to us? And I came up with the idea of a midwinter vacation. And I asked them to give up 3 vacation days, to put it into President's Week, so that instead of only 2 days off that week, they got an entire week. They gave up 3 vacation days, and I got $200 million worth of givebacks. So I also had to promise when we announced it that not to say a word about the givebacks, because they didn't want their members to hear anything other than they got an extra week of paid vacation. But, you know, there are ways to work collaboratively, but I think the money, as you pointed out, is toxic. And it doesn't help get the most innovative and creative things done that could be beneficial. Yes?
Jamie Saunders from United Way, and so I am just loving this talk because I think the history of United Way, founded by George Eastman, is this idea of the sectors, the cross sectors, so public, private, and not-for-profit. I was wondering though, in your discussion, you talked a lot about public, private partnerships, but have you seen that trifecta? Have you seen a very effective examples or models where you have the not-for-profits, the private sector, and the public sector who are really driving in the same direction? You talked about the skills gap. Obviously, the not-for-profit community helps in terms of workforce development and training, in terms of placement, in terms of retention. We know and we're proud at United Way to do the corporate social responsibility and to be able to help companies retain their employees because they love to give back in meaningful ways. But just wondering in your book, which I haven't read yet, but I will, if there's other examples of where you have the three.
I think that the role of the business community in helping the not-for-profit sector is not really understood as much as it should be. Who serves on the boards of not-for-profit organizations? People from the business community. They give money, they give their time, they give their talent, they try to improve the not-for-profit organizations. They could help them, I believe, in their relationship with government. You know, sort of if you look at how not-for-profit organizations are funded, part of it is through private support, but the lion's share of it is through government contracts, especially in the area of social services. So if you looked at United Way agencies, many of them are multi-service agencies. So they exist on 5 contracts, 10 contracts, some of them 20 different contracts. Every single one of them has to be audited separately. Every single one of them has to have a different financial reporting system. Every single one of them has a different accounting system. Could they be collected in one solid contract? That's easy to do through technology. That's an opportunity for government, business, and the voluntary sector to work together to reform the government contracts process, because that would actually generate financial savings for not-for-profit organizations out of the insanity of the administrative system and give them an opportunity to invest it in higher quality services. And that's not something that exists, but it could exist. When you look at how a business treats a customer, they have a variety of shortcuts for a customer who is a strong customer. If you're dealing with a bank and you're a good customer, you have less administrative rule or regulation. So if you had a not-for-profit organization that was a highly skilled, effective organization, why wouldn't it be a good idea to strip away some of the needless regulation and have them operate in a more effective kind of way? I think it's a failure to understand the difference between administration and administrivia and the actual importance of direct services. I think most people think the social safety net is provided by government, but it isn't. It's provided by not-for-profit organizations. It's funded by government in a very inefficient way. And when I talked about government regulating business in an ineffective way, they regulate not-for-profit organizations in an ineffective way. That has to change. And I think business leadership could play a role when the not-for-profit is going to argue with government about its regulation. They're a single voice. But if they had more influencers, they might be more effective. You're welcome. Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name's Taylor Copian from Rochester, born and raised here. Appreciate you taking the time to come here. There's some big things coming up. And one of those is the millennial engagement. We literally call it the young professional community. We have an organization here called RYP. The president of the board is on in here, Mr. Ruber here, Andrew Brady. think of doing a podcast with them later. One of the things that maybe you could talk about is how the young professional, how you get them to engage the community to make it better. I think that me being a millennial as well, we're trying to make the community a better place to live by volunteering, doing extracurricular things to make this world a better place to live, especially with the Rochester community. But from your experience and the things that you've done, what are 2 or 3 things that the young professional community can do to really make a dent in making Rochester better?
Well, I start off with the fact that the attitude of the millennial community about where they want to work and what they want to do, their attitudes have changed. They're more interested in working with companies that have a strong set of corporate social responsibility activities. So that's something, an attitudinal change. At the Harvard Business School, there are more students in the Social Responsibility Club than all the other clubs on campus put together. Now, 15 years ago, that would have been unheard of, but that just demonstrates the attitudinal change of young people in business schools. And the same is true of young people in law schools and undergraduate schools. They want to be more engaged and involved in their community. So how do you do that? Let me give you one example. There was a lot of discussion in the private sector. Should you give your employees a day off to do community service? And when we thought about this at IBM, we thought maybe there's another and better way to do that. And what we did is we said if an employee on their own time contributed 40 hours a year of community service on their own time, we would make a $1,000 contribution in that person's name to the organization where they contributed their volunteer time. So they had to work out their time with their manager. It wasn't paid time. They had to do it on their own. But it resulted in them getting an actual financial benefit, not to them, but to the organization where they contributed their time. Last year at IBM, across the countries, IBM employees contributed 1.1 million hours of community service on their own time. So did that incent young people and all people to do more community service? Yes. Is it popular among our employees? Very popular. Is it a model that others could consider? Yes. Most companies have some type of financial contribution program they might do to an individual not-for-profit organization. But what about supporting the activities of your employees so you get a double bang for the buck? You get the contribution and you also get the time of your employees. I think that's one thing. The second thing is we can try to encourage more of our employees to engage in a leadership role for not-for-profit organizations. Many not-for-profits have junior boards or boards of directors. What about encouraging your employees to do that? We again had a program at IBM where we took a look at all of our emerging leaders within the company and we tried to help them get placement on boards of not-for-profit organizations. They appreciated that. By the way, we also looked strategically as, is it a board that would have other members that would actually benefit the company from the networks and contacts that individual got? So it wound up not only benefiting the individual, but it actually wound up benefiting the business. It created opportunity through those networks and creative opportunities. So I think there are a lot of things that could be done that would inspire and create more opportunity for young people. I also think that there are a lot of things for all employees to engage more in communities. And I think it would build the brand of companies so that they wouldn't be up for criticism. They would be more guarded against that criticism. I use the example when I talked earlier about Starbucks, and I'm not interested in endorsing anybody running for any kind of office, but I'm just talking about a company. Starbucks had a problem in Philadelphia when an African-American customer was harassed in that Starbucks. I think because Starbucks had the free tuition policy for their employees who worked 20 hours a week, they got less criticism than a company might have had they not had a more established brand in the area of corporate engagement and corporate responsibility. So I think this is something that is a benefit to your bottom line. And I think from the standpoint of young people, they're more likely to want to work and want to stay working at companies that have a strong ethic and strong profile in the community. Yes?
So you were talking about, you cited a study, and I've seen a lot of studies that show that corporate social responsibility, there's a bottom line impact. And I've always kind of been trying to say if it can lower turnover, if it can increase the bottom line, all these sorts of things, what if a whole community tried to adopt this as an economic development strategy, essentially? And then in your book you talk about how, there should be, it perked my ears up, you're talking about how, chambers of commerce locally could require some kind of something for membership or create a training community around that. So are there any chambers that are doing that, or local communities that are really trying to have a community-wide CSR policy or learning community, and what might that look like here?
I don't think that there are examples, and that's why I talked about the importance of cross-sector leadership. I think that when we put together what do we want from government, we have each segment of society in a silo. We don't look at what could we do collaboratively together that would engage everyone, so that when the business community is coming forward with its agenda, it might be around workplace development, it might be around skills. That's something that benefits the not-for-profit community. It's something that benefits government. So it shouldn't be just the business community arguing that skills is important for them. It should be something that we'd be arguing together. So I think having people in a more collaborative way working on these problems is something that I think is what we would like to see going forward. I don't think it exists right now. I think we're basically looking at each segment separately, that things that benefit one segment, but not understanding about the collaborative ways that we could operate cross-sector, public, private, and voluntary. So I think that's what the opportunity is, I think, to think differently about these issues. The skill issue that we're facing right now, look, 99% of the middle wage and high wage jobs that are being developed, about 10 million of them, all require a post-secondary degree. Do you know how many jobs requiring only a high school diploma disappeared over the last 5 years in the United States? 7 million of them. Where's the opportunity? Not just a high school diploma. We've got to find a way to get people some type of post-secondary degree or credential. We've been judging our school systems, not just Rochester. We've been judging school systems in the United States. What's your rate, high school diploma rate? It's not enough. We got to think differently. There are a lot of young people who have a high school diploma who aren't college ready. That's something that benefits young people. It benefits the business community. It benefits society. So that shouldn't be one segment of society's agenda. We have, on a federal level, we have an apprenticeship program. The U.S. Department of Labor funds apprenticeship programs. They're about bringing people into the workforce. What about Apprenticeship 2.0 to keep people with the skills that they need in the workforce? That's an opportunity. Do you know how many people are at risk of losing their jobs because they don't have the education and skill to keep them? Over 20 million. So is that something that is it just the business community that wants that to happen? Is it just that not-for-profit organizations that want people to have an acceptable wage, not to be on the downside and part of the social safety net? That's something that benefits us all. And I think getting together to create that agenda and solve those problems, that's the future, and that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Good time. One more question, if you have it. Anybody?
My last comment is thank you very much.